The most widely published book in human history reveals that we are created in the image of God. Throughout our human journey, each encounter is an opportunity to see the shared humanity in ourselves and others. Regardless of one's views on religion, each experience and each story weaves us together towards a common path. A path of transformation, a process of growth and understanding, a recognition that, at our core, we share a common destiny. What does the search for truth really mean in our lives? How can we find a sense of unity in a world so diverse and divided? As we reflect on these questions, we start to uncover a fundamental connection that binds us all beyond our differences. Welcome to Created in the Image of God, Building Vibrant Communities, with our host, Wade Franson. Tonight's episode is Fake ID and the Search for Truth.
Welcome to the Created in the Image of God show. I'm here with Abdu Murray, and if all goes well, we're pre-recording this. It is now May 19th, and you're tuned in to listen to a show from a gentleman who was a committed Muslim, and after an 9-year investigation, moved from being a Muslim to being a Christian. And along the way, he spent a lot of time applying intellectual rigor, investigating historical, also philosophically, theologically, and also through science, the claims of Christianity to arrive at his position. Welcome to the studio, Abdu.
Hey, it's great to be with you, Wade. Thanks for having me on. I'm really excited about our conversation.
Well, as am I. I always am impressed by and admire people who have migrated in the way that you have, because it's my fantasy that you've looked at the thing from opposing sides. You know, there's this scientific method which can be oversimplified as thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, right?
Yeah.
You form a hypothesis, you test that hypothesis, and you arrive at a conclusion. And many people don't do that. Many people just grow up believing what they believe. They never question it. They never examine it. Whether right or wrong, whether the decision's right or wrong, you've learned a ton along the way. And today we're going to explore what you've learned. But as we always do on this show, we start with sort of your backstory, so we get to know the real you. Tell us a little bit about the circumstances into which you were born. Were you born into a Muslim family, etc.? And how did those forces shape you growing up?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was born and raised in the United States to Muslim immigrant parents. My dad came over, actually. My mom was Catholic and converted to Islam, actually, and is a very committed Muslim. So I grew up in a committed Muslim home. And like most families from religious backgrounds, you have a realism there. And that realism is people are of varying levels of devotion and commitment to their worldview. I mean, I don't care what religion someone aspires to or ascribes to. There are people who are extremely devoted, and there are people who are culturally committed, and there are people who are like, yeah, you know, whatever. But I was raised in a home that was pretty committed. And that really shaped a lot of how I interacted with the people around me. In the area I grew up in Southeast Lower Michigan, back then it wasn't nearly as diverse as it is now. We were sort of, as Lebanese people, we were sort of the dollop of olive oil in the pot of rice, as it were, which made us exotic, which also gave us a chance to be able to speak about some of the things that people were intellectually or just socially curious about. And this is, by the way, well before 9/11. So people weren't as curious about Islam as they had become after September 11th, 2001. But when I was a kid growing up, people were curious enough to where I could talk to them. And so the conviction I had as a Shia Muslim was that Islam was true. Everything else was by definition, anything that disagreed with the fundamental tenets of Islam was by definition, therefore, false. Under the idea that that which is true necessarily excludes that which is its opposite. So I grew up kind of believing that anything that's true is true, whether it's for you or for me. It just is. And our opinions are sort of irrelevant. Now, we have the ability to sort of arrive at these truths or approximate them based on the imperfection of our ability to know the truth, but true is true, whether anyone believes it or no one believes it. So I had this idea of relativism, and what's true for you is true for you, what's true for me is true for me, I wouldn't have any of it because I didn't believe that my religion allowed me to actually believe that. So I would engage in conversations with people about religious verities. I was sort of a strange duck because I was an athletic kid. I'm very tall. You can't tell from this video, but I'm 6'7", which is unusual for a Lebanese guy. But I was 6'7". I played a lot of sports, martial arts, a lot of basketball. Ended up getting at some point a scholarship to play Division I basketball. That changed a lot because of various reasons, including a knee injury. But I was highly competitive. I was super sportsy, super jockey. But I also really liked nerdy stuff. And I would engage in philosophical conversations with people about faith issues, because even though I was a red-blooded American teenager, I still wanted to talk about things that mattered ultimately. And so I would engage with Christians, and Christians were sort of low-hanging fruit, you know. It wasn't, I was a sort of an equal opportunity faith knocker outer over. If you were someone who wasn't a Muslim, you got to hear why you were wrong and I was right at some point. But Christians were sort of low-hanging fruit. And this goes back to what we were talking about in sort of the beginning and how you introduced everything was people don't really think through matters of faith. And so back in the 80s and the 90s, I'm a child of the 70s, but I remember the 80s and the 90s because, you know, that's when I remember my interactions. In those days, it was fashionable to say you were a Christian, even if you didn't mean it. That's kind of over now, but it was fashionable back then. So I'd ask Christians, hey, why are you a Christian? And the why question threw them off because, like, well, you don't ask why questions. You just are. This is a faith thing. And faith is belief without any good reason, not despite bad reasons, but you just believe it because you believe it. And I said, well, that's not how I think of faith. You actually do think these things through. And they would say tradition is, you know, I'm a Presbyterian because I go to the Presbyterian church on Christmas and Easter. So I'm a Presbyterian. And they would answer it like it was a question. I'm like, are you sure? Like, do you even know? My response was usually something along the lines of, why would you trust the destiny of your eternal soul to a system of belief that someone else thought through? You don't do that with anything else in your life. Your retirement, your marriage, whether you should have kids or not, the job you're going to pick, everything is thought through, but not your eternity. So I would launch into why I thought whatever their belief system was, and usually, like I said, it was Christianity, was wrong. And part of that was because a lot of times Muslims, especially in the West, are raised with a steady diet of apologetics, a defense of their faith, why they believe that Islam is true, and they're given some arguments for that, but also some polemics, why Christianity is false. Now, a lot of religions they'll talk about as well, but Christianity in specific, and one of the reasons is because when you're a Muslim growing up in the West, you consider the West to be a Christian culture, and the United States specifically being a Christian culture. So what's interesting about that is your identity isn't just wrapped up in staying Muslim. Sorry, I should say it differently. Your identity isn't wrapped up in just converting people to Islam. It's mostly wrapped up in staying Muslim, because of the social pressures outside to sort of cave to that. So a lot of it is inoculation from outside forces, changing you and having you lose that sort of like hang of otherness. You know, you're unique because you're a Muslim and you're a minority. Stay that way. So that was a big part of how I thought about things as well. I wanted to convert people to Islam, but I also wanted to stay that way. I wanted to stay a Muslim despite all the social pressures around me to sort of become at least culturally Christian, if not completely actually Christian. That was a big formative part of my thinking when I was growing up.
Thank you so much. I'm just sitting here drinking all this in. It's just awesome to think myself into your situation and look at this nation and life from a perspective that I haven't really done before. There's a lot of similarities in my own path, but also a lot of differences, obviously.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask a very general question related to Islam, right? So Muhammad came, obviously, what, 600 and some years after Jesus? And so within Islam, there would be the idea that Islam is kind of a successor religion because Islam accepts Jesus, right? And there's a quibble about how and why, but they don't They don't argue that there was a person named Jesus. They don't argue that he came from God. They consider him a prophet, and so on and so forth. Now, Christians would take umbrage at, how they characterize Jesus, but Muslims accept themselves as part of the Abrahamic tradition, and in that sense, a successor religion to Judaism and Christianity. Is that fair?
Yeah, and I think that that's important the way you put it too, the successor religion. There's a well-known imam in the area here who I've heard say on numerous occasions, basically what you just said. It's a successor religion. He compares it, and I understand what he's trying to get at, but it is a little on the condescending side. And I want to be fair to him, but you can see clips of him all over the place saying something like this: is that Judaism is grade school, Christianity is high school, and Islam is college. So it's not just a continuation of something that develops more, it actually is an improvement upon and a sophistication upon prior revelation. So it's not just additional revelation, which I think is a different way to look at things. It is an improvement upon. And for me, Christianity isn't a successor to Judaism so much as it is the fulfillment of Old Testament Judaism. So it isn't better. It's actually the full story realized in this sort of progressive revelation that doesn't say this is better than this.
Right. Jesus himself said, I am not come to destroy, I am come to fulfill.
Right. And so Muslims would say, and by the way, they would take that phrase right from Jesus's lips, and I've heard him say this many times, is that means he has come to actually do all the things the law requires, because that's what a good person does, and that's what gets you into heaven. Whereas I would say that's a different interpretation that I think Jesus actually meant, which is fulfilling as the Messiah who dies for the sins of the world. So that's where the difference comes in. But I think you're right in saying that Islam would consider itself a successor religion in the sense that it does two things. One's ironic, is that a Muslim would say that Islam is not a new religion that succeeds old. It is a new expression that restores original religion. So Muslims would say that, Abraham was a Muslim, Moses was a Muslim, Jesus was a Muslim, Noah, Adam were all Muslims. And so everything else that happened in Judaism and Christianity, the reason why they're only grade school and high school is because they're corrupt, palliated versions of the original. And Islam has always been college level, but we just need to come back to it. That's what I think they would say if I was being fair to them. That's why they say people don't convert to Islam, they revert.
Yeah. Well, this is fascinating from a number of perspectives, so I want to dig a little bit deeper into it. And one of the quotes that comes to mind is Jesus, and I forget how many times he says this, but it's the topic, the heading of my second book, The Hardness of the Heart, where Jesus is tested by the rabbis around the subject of divorce. They essentially said, hey, Moses allowed us to kick our wives to the curb for all these different reasons. What do you say? And Jesus says, Moses allowed it because of the hardness of your heart. But from the beginning, it was not so. Right. So in that sense, yes, Jesus was a reformer, pointing people back to the original intent. So there's validity to that perspective. You follow me?
Yeah.
But now from a Baha'i perspective, and not full disclosure, I am an adherent of the Baha'i faith. There's this thing called progressive revelation. Yeah. And so the sort of, in my opinion, oversimplified understanding of that is kind of that successor idea, right? And when I had to first wrestle with this idea, and I looked at Islam, I'm like, Islam isn't progress. I would agree it's regression, right? Because it takes you back to many of the approaches that you find in Judaism, whereas Christianity, as understood and practiced, sort of may take you off into left field, not to describe right or left necessarily, but to where, we talked about hyper grace earlier. And then in the book of Revelation, chapter 12, it says the dragon goes to make war with the remnant of her seed who have the law and the testimony of Jesus, that you have both these things. So where you move away, or you maybe get a little bit loose with the law, Islam was a religion that pointed you back to the law, in a sense. What's your reaction to what I've just said? So in terms of progress, is it linear? Is it?
Yeah, I think it's more of a qualitative thing than it is a linear progression, or it's certainly not, I don't think, a chronological thing. I do think Islam, there's a great book by a friend of mine named Mark Dury, which is called The Quran and Its Biblical Reflexes. And what he talks about there is the way in which Islam actually borrows from some of the things in Judaism and the previous things, but in some ways it does it to serve an agenda that I would say, from my perspective, is antithetical to the way the revelation was progressing toward. So in other words, it's not a regression to say, go back to this original so that you can understand the full fulfillment. It's a way to say, go back to this original, and then a new branch forms. It's almost like sort of the silly, this is a terrible, silly example, but it's like the Back to the Future movies where Marty goes back in time and then creates an alternative new future because he goes back in time and does something with the time-space continuum, creating a new alternate branch so that all futures from that alternate branch can never get you back to the original future that was supposed to be created. That's kind of how I see it. And I think the chief reason for that, well, not the chief reason, but a prime example would be the fact that what Islam says specifically in the Quran, which is, of course, the fundamental text of Muslims, it's the one that Muslims around the world would say, regardless of hadith literature, regardless of any of the commentaries by the Muslim scholars, whatever it is, the Quran is the supreme authority, and anything that approximates it at best is a human approximation. But because the Quran is the dictated word of God, it must be the authority. The Quran says specifically that they did not kill him, nor did they crucify him, but it looked like it to them. It denies the divinity of Christ. It says that the Trinity is an overextension of true monotheistic belief, et cetera, et cetera. So in that sense, and this is what I wrestled with when I was sort of coming to understand why the Quran references the Bible in very positive terms. You see this in Surah 5, verse 46 and 47. You see it in verse 68 of the same chapter. You see it in Surah 3, where the disciples are called the ones who are the uppermost and who are the ones who prevail over the unbelievers. You see this laudatory nature in which the Quran actually expresses value for the Bible in the present tense. In the Arabic, by the way, it's present tense. Right. So in the 7th century, those phrases would have zero meaning about talking to Christians and Jews about how they had to yuqimu in Arabic is to observe, present tense, in the plural, the Taurat and the Injil, specifically by name. If they didn't exist back then, or if they were corrupted, then the phrase is meaningless. Yet at the same time, the Quran denies as facts that which those texts actually propose as not only facts in themselves, but the ultimate fact. If Jesus didn't die on a cross, then when he says, do not think that I have come to be served, but to serve and give my life as a ransom for many, that phrase means nothing if he doesn't die on a cross. And it means even less if he didn't rise from the dead. Yet the Quran rejects that specifically. So in that sense, this idea of going back to the law, I get what's going on there in one sense, because it's a solidarity with Christians and Jews who hold the law in high esteem. Funny, I was just doing my studies of Romans chapter 7 and 8, where Paul talks about the law. But he also says that the law is good because it reveals something in me that I need fixing. And that's the whole idea of the cross, is what it does is fix. It pays the penalty, but the Holy Spirit is involved in our lives to actually fix us and save us from this wretched body of death, as Paul says. So in that sense, it's a regression, but it's also a divergence, because it denies that central claim that Christianity would say, there is no Christianity without a cross and without a resurrection. What's the point? As Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapters 15 and other places, that if Jesus is not raised, then the dead are not raised. And if the dead are not raised, then we are of all people to be most pitied, because our faith is in vain, because that is the central fact of the faith. So yeah, in one sense, I agree with the regressive nature and progress in the sense of going back to that which was important, but I would say it's actually regress, and in the negative sense, because it forsakes the central point.
Awesome. So I want to make one more comment and then ask a quick question before we go into the next segment.
Sure.
The comment is just on this idea of kindergarten, grade school, college.
Yeah.
when you get into college, you don't get to throw out your ABCs. You don't get to forget
Right.
your addition and your multiplication, right?
Yeah.
Because you're now doing calculus.
Hmm. Right. No, that's true. But see, that actually, that's a great observation, and that undercuts an Islamic perspective of saying, therefore it's college, because you literally said, forget the ABCs, the foundational understanding from the sacrificial system all the way from Adam, where
Yep.
his sin was not, his shame was not dealt with until God put an animal skin around him. He was already covered, but he still felt naked until that animal skin was created. In other words, the blood was shed, which is a foreshadowing of what's to come
Right.
in there.
Amen.
So, yeah.
And so, and again, at the college level, you can go deeper and deeper and deeper and unpack and unpack. And, science today is uncovering the underlying realities that have led to past conclusions, right?
Mhm.
And that's where the geekiness you mentioned earlier, you geeking out. I love it, and I do it all the time, going back to those. So one last comment, sort of as a Baha'i in particular, and that is that I personally accept the validity of these various revelations, but you cannot use them as trump cards against each other. You have to dig and dig and dig until they're not at odds with each other. And I personally believe it's possible, not on this show about those points, maybe on an additional show, we could go into some of the language and the translations and the interpretations, but I believe it is resolvable, is my point. Having said that, so in your own personal story, you talked a little bit about, the polemic side, the apologetic side. What was the point in your life that you'd like to highlight as sort of a full coming of age and a transition into the life's work that you've been engaged in? What was that moment?
Well, the moment really happened at the moment when I realized that the faith I was trying so desperately not to have actually was the faith that was I so desperately needed. You have this phrase in Islam, Allahu Akbar, God is greater. And I thought that the Trinity, the Incarnation, and the cross all insulted God's greatness. And at some point, I came to realize that those are the very things that I believe actually demonstrate his greatness. And through that study, I realized something pretty interesting about myself, which is that I'm a sort of a natural born advocate, which is why I became a lawyer. I'm undergraduate in psychology. I love the way people think. I love the way to understand how people's beliefs about the world and about themselves actually shape their psyches and both the emotional and intellectual life of every person. But then I also like the way evidence is marshaled. I love to see a good argument actually unfold. And I actually believe all those things can come together because we have false beliefs about ourselves that really hurt our sense of self. And we have true beliefs about ourselves and the world that can augment, even though it doesn't make the world comfortable all the time, it can augment our sense of identity and self-worth. So the fact that I was passionate about psychology, but also passionate about how argumentation works and how someone proves a case, really melded together to understand that as a natural born advocate who cares about the way people think, that I really did feel that my life's work was going to be about melding those two things together, which is why I don't believe in our organization. We're an apologetics evangelism organization, but really what we're about is what Paul says in Colossians chapter 4, verses 5 and 6, is we walk in wisdom toward outsiders, making the best use of the time. And then he says, let your speech be gracious, seasoned with salt, so you may know how you ought to answer each person. And that last part's really important to me because it's not about answering a worldview or answering a question. It's about answering a person with the big issues of life. And if you answer a person, you get the question thrown in. So questions don't need answers, but people need answers. And they use their questions to get them. So it was at that point when I realized I'm a natural born advocate. I converted to Christianity right when I became a lawyer. So I graduated law school, took the bar exam, started my job, and then became a Christian almost it was in that order, and it was almost at the same time, it seemed like. So that natural born sense of advocacy for something I thought was true and that was valuable to human beings, I thought, boy, I want to talk about this. I want to write about this if anybody will listen. I have no illusions, by the way, that I have a right to do that. I have a privilege, and that privilege is something I don't take for granted. So if anybody listens to anything I have to say, no one's more shocked about it than me. But for whatever reason, people have listened and they've read my books. And the other thing too is I love the way language actually conveys truth beautifully. So I take umbrage, for example, with someone like an Elon Musk who said that, pretty soon with Neuralink and all these developments, we'll be able to get rid of this cumbersome idea of words where we have to cram our thoughts into a word. What a valuable exercise it is to try to find the right word. It hones and crafts and creates our expression in a way that simple emotive thought just doesn't do. I love the so-called limitation of language as the actual freeing.
In the beginning was the word.
Exactly. This is the kind of thing that, to me, is just. I hope we never lose that sense of a love of words. But anyway, that's my life's calling: is to read, is to speak and read and write about this kind of stuff. And I think to help people see that truth is liberating.
I'm going to take this in an interesting direction when we return, so don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with more of Abdu Murray on Created in the Image of God.
Something is deeply wrong, and we can all feel it. Culture tells us we're nothing but machines. It also tells us we're gods who can reshape reality by sheer will. Both can't be true, so it creates a kind of cultural schizophrenia, where we can no longer tell what's authentic from what's artificial, and it's collapsing reality itself. But we're not machines to upgrade. We're not gods whose bodies are playthings or prisons. What we are is something the world is forgetting, but desperately needs to remember. Because only the truth about what we are can restore our sense of what's real.
Welcome back to Created in the Image of God. I'm here with Abdu Murray. And right before the break, we learned how he, in rapid succession, became an attorney, became a Christian, and launched into a life's work that is a privilege, right? I want to quickly have you share some of the things you're doing, the credentials, before we get into the next question that I have for you. I know you've written books, you've been involved in organizations. Just tell us a little bit about what the essence is of your work right now.
Yeah, so the essence of what we do at Embrace the Truth is to offer the credibility of the gospel to every questioner we encounter, which means that how I tagline it is that we go to places we thought we could never go, to say things we thought we could never say, to people we thought would never listen. But they are, in fact, listening. So we do a lot of speaking, at churches, but I do dialogues and debates in conference halls. I just finished a debate not too long ago with a very famous atheist named Dan Barker, who was part of the New Atheist movement on the idea of purpose. We go to universities. I love to go to secular universities and speak on the intersection of faith and culture, especially on hot button issues of the day. While I love speaking in churches and talking to Christians as well, honestly, I really like talking to non-Christians even more, because I think that interaction is fruitful, and I also, it's like it is with Christians, but my goal is to introduce people to who I think the real Jesus actually is. So that's what most of the work is. Now, we do a lot of writing and article publishing on our website at Embrace the Truth. We do a podcast called All Rise, where we explore various things, especially from a legal perspective, where I take my legal training in the rules of evidence and logic and persuasion, and address various challenges to the Christian faith and arguments in favor of the Christian faith from that perspective. But then I love writing books, and really my books have been centered on the idea of the intersection of faith and culture as the culture currently stands. So a lot of my books, I hope, are evergreen enough to stand the test of time. But really, as things begin to emerge, I like to think that I'm a student of culture and I pay attention. And when I see certain cultural moods emerge, I want to write about those things and where I'm borrowing from Leslie Newbigin when he writes about Christ, our eternal contemporary. I like to think that the biblical message is eternally contemporary. It's ancient, and it was given to us in a culture far different than 21st century West, yet it seems to apply all the time. So that's where my life work is taking me now, is all over the world, places that, like I said, are sometimes hostile to my message and sometimes curious, but it's always fulfilling. It's always pretty great when I get to do it.
Well, and I love your emphasis on the power of words. I have to share a couple of the titles of your books because I love them. Grand Central Question, right?
Mhm.
Apocalypse Later, More Than a White Man's Religion. And then your newly released Fake ID, How AI and Identity Ideology Are Collapsing Reality and What to Do About It. So earlier on, we also talked about this sort of idea of representation and, to pick on white women for a moment, having, stepped up to speak on behalf of other people. And you mentioned there was a recent video or exchange where a Persian woman was telling a white woman to stop speaking for her about the situation in Iran. And so this is what I want to probe a little bit, because you said a few minutes ago that you recognize that it's not a right, it's a privilege to speak, and hopefully people are listening. You mentioned that as a Lebanese immigrant, your family were Shia Muslims. And then this idea of right versus privilege, we have a big war going on. I don't want to get into the war at all. There's a big war right now, a consequential war, a war with ramifications that spill way, way beyond the current immediate tactical activities. But it's an ideological war. One side has been calling the other the great Satan, and going back to the Reagan eras, there was a takeoff on the Beach Boys' Barbara Ann, bomb Iran, right?
Yeah, I remember.
So this has been a meme that's gone on for a long time between these two ideologies. It's almost like the space race between the Soviet Union and the United States, which was won by the United States. And we built what I call the Tower to Heaven, in that we got to the moon and they didn't. But now you've got this kind of spiritual, cultural warfare, this civil, a clash between different civilizations that aren't based on geopolitical power, but rather the minds and hearts of people. Which ideology? Of course, there was ideology too between communism and capitalism, but this is different. Anyway, my point is, the underpinnings of particularly the religion of Shia Islam, and this idea of when you were talking early on about there's one truth and it doesn't matter how you perceive it or how you perceive it, there's an objective truth. This is kind of an idea that comes from a fundamentalist view of things, right? That there's one objective truth, and that it should be applied, even maybe forced on everybody. Whereas in America, you have freedom of religion, and you even have the freedom from religion society that says you have no religion. America is enabled to embrace more of that plurality. Just speak to this a little bit when you talk about culture and being a student of culture.
Yeah, so I would actually say
I said a lot there, and I apologize.
Yeah,
I went all over the
okay. No, not at all, not at all. So I won't get to probably all of it, but I will say this is that I would say that having a sense of objective truth can sound fundamentalist depending on how you actually approach it and how you say some things. But that there's an objective truth, I don't think is a hallmark of fundamentalism in the pejorative sense of that word. Like you're a backwards thinking rube kind of person who thinks that your truth is, you have the lock on truth, and everyone else is some kind of a backwards idiot who that's a caricature. But unfortunately, it's also true in some senses with some folks. I do think there are objective truths, and I think that there are we have an epistemic issue. Epistemic meaning, how do we actually know what's true? That's an imperfect thing. That things are objectively true, I think, is not an imperfect understanding, because the minute you say there are no objective truths, that statement itself has to be objectively true, in which case now you've admitted that there are objective truths by saying there aren't any, because the statement itself has to be true. So I think it's fundamentally self-defeating to say there are no such things as objective truths. But that doesn't mean that we have a lock on understanding those objective truths. For me as a Christian, the fundamental, I think, objective truth, which I think you can walk through actually and eventually prove in the sense of, not in the mathematical certainty sense, but you can have stronger evidence towards this, is that human beings are made in the image of God. And here we are talking about that on a show called That. I think that truth is actually demonstrable. Now, what that means for me in the culture and in the context of engaging with people who don't agree with what I believe is that offers me something. That offers me the ability to say, if I look at a person, no matter what their worldview actually is, whether it's Shia Islam, Sunni Islam, whether they're Wahhabi or Salafi, whether they're Buddhist, whether they're Theravada or Mahayana, whether they're Baha'i, whether they're Christian, whether they're atheist, whatever it is, I can take a look at their ideas and I can say, those ideas are either laudable, horrible, partly horrible, whatever it is, and say, I can divorce the person and their value from the value of their ideas because they're made in the imago Dei, the image of God. I didn't put that image on them. God did. No matter what they say, think, believe, or do, that image is on them. We can stray from what it means to have that image, but that image is indelibly marked on us, which means that they have an infinite value that ought not to be violated. So that means that when that person who bears that image of God has an idea I don't agree with, let's say I don't agree with it philosophically or factually or even morally, I can divorce the value of their idea from the value of the person such that I can respond to, try to combat, maybe even prove false this idea, but I dare not try to eradicate the person who holds it. And I think in our current culture, we've lost all sense of that. Our identities are no longer these thick, robust things we used to think of ourselves as. Now we're these paper-thin things where, just as a short excursus before I get to the main point I'm trying to talk about here, is that we used to have this idea that human beings were embodied. We have a body. That body can't be wrong. It can decay. It can be imperfect, and all of ours are. But the body itself was a valuable thing. But we are a transcendent soul. And that soul idea is this thick, meaty, robust idea that we have the capacity for communion, one with the other, but also vertically with the transcendent immaterial God. So our immaterial nature communes with the immaterial God. It interacts with our body. But over the course of the years, we over-psychologized and under-spiritualized ourselves. And then we came down to this slightly thinner idea of the self, where everything is psychologized and it's like the traumas of life, how they impact me and how I impact others. So it's still semi-communal, but it's lost that transcendent sense. So it's becoming more and more inward looking. And in the most recent decades, we have this idea of identity, which I think is an unbiblical idea. Not the idea of identity specifically, but the current cultural way we think of identity is so thin from the thick idea. It's so thin now that it's barely thicker than the bumper stickers we slap on the back of our Subarus to tell everybody what our opinions are. And so because they're so frail and so thin, anytime I respond to someone else's opinions, I've responded to their identity. So now we have these constant existential crises. Like if you disagree with me, then you must think I don't have a right to exist, which means that I have to feel the same way about you. That is not the way it's supposed to be. We can disagree adamantly about someone else's opinions and their views. And because they're not paper thin, because they're not held on to the fabric of reality by simply the weakest glue possible, I can engage robustly with someone's idea and still value them as a person. So that's, to me, where a worldview that grounds us in the imago Dei, in the image of God, helps us culturally, where we can value human beings without having to necessarily agree with their opinions, and we don't feel this existential sort of crisis that maybe I'll be eradicated. And that's why I think cancel culture in the West has leveled up to assassination culture, because people just assume your ideas and you are the same thing. It's a long way to go about it, but I do think that's how I see my worldview. And I think any worldview that has a transcendent worldview can actually contribute to the conversations far better than one that is under-spiritualized or unspiritualized.
I love where you went with that and how you unpacked it. Of course, I love that you referenced the title of the show as well. But it is critically important. And, there's this very simple phrase that has fallen out of fashion that used to be very accepted, and that is, hate the sin, love the sinner.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been deconstructed in so many ways because we can't talk about sin today at all.
Right. Yeah.
When you mention AI, I read an article in the Free Press. You may have seen it. It came out a day or two ago, where there's now somebody wrote a book together with AI and asked for a new moral code for today's society, and it like rewrote the 10 Commandments. And they're all good. You would agree with every single one of those.
Mhm.
And the last one says something about accepting the sacred nature of our existence or whatever.
Mhm.
But it's just like tipping your hat in some vague homage to a higher power. What's grossly lacking is in the original 10 Commandments, the first 4 are all about that higher power.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's so funny you say that, because we can have a hat tip to these things, but it's almost like we acknowledge some people think that way, kind of a thing, and we don't want to leave them
Yeah,
out.
exactly. We've matured above it, right? We can forget our ABCs, and you need those things, but they were actually wrong, right?
Right.
And now you should shed them like a snake sheds its skin, because we're so morally superior
Mhm.
because we've evolved beyond that.
Well, it's funny because I looked at 2 things in developing in the world of AI, and because of the book, I'm a student of this stuff now. Sam Altman was being the founder of OpenAI, was being interviewed about the amount of power and water needed to run the data centers, because it's
Right.
staggeringly high.
My
And
son reminds me every time I do a chat. She said, "You just wasted a cup of water."
yeah. So in light of that, his response was something along the lines of, well, think about it. The amount of resources it takes to train a child before it gets smart. The reason why that's startling is because that's the exact language AI developers use to talk about developing Claude or ChatGPT or Gemini. You train the model until it gets smart. So he started equating human development with software development. And that's what? So you can see they're slipping it in. But I will say this, my optimism is sort of like peaked a little bit, because Anthropic, the guys who make Claude, they had a council about the next iteration of AI as it gets smarter and smarter. How do we infuse it with a fundamental ethical code? And the people they brought in were not only business people and code people and ethics people of a secular variety, but they brought in a massive number of people, or I shouldn't say massive, I should say an impressive number of people of faith traditions. And the Anthropic folks took it very seriously. Like, we need to integrate this experience and understanding of the transcendent into our computing. And that's important, because one of the things that go into my book is the whole idea of transhumanism, which is the idea that through technology we'll improve on the model, will become post-human, and then we'll eventually merge, if Ray Kurzweil is right, in 2029, artificial intelligence will become artificially generally intelligent and then far exceed us and become godlike. And so what's interesting about this, Wade, is that the transhumanist is looking to a religious experience, but it's completely materialistic. Is that we are just data. You and I have the illusion of consciousness, but we're just patterns of data. And because of that, we can upload our data to some kind of storage medium. And then when AGI becomes super smart, that will merge with the AGI and it will essentially become godlike. And that is religious. In fact, John Horgan, writing for Scientific American, called it the rapture of the nerds. And so it's a religious expression, but it's devoid of true transcendent foundations for it. So,
well, let's put a pin in it and build on that when we come back from this next commercial break. Do you have time to continue for a few minutes? I just looked at my calendar and I can. Awesome. Sure. So we'll be right back after this message to pick up where we're left off and crash land this plane. Don't go anywhere. You're on Created in the Image of God with Abdu Murray.
As Baha'is, we're called to build vibrant devotional communities in every neighborhood. Facets of One is a simple tool to help you do just that. 9 devotions, drawing from the world's sacred scriptures, including the writings of the Bab and Baha'u'llah, all centered on one truth, the oneness of God and the shared light of His manifestations. Designed for friends of all backgrounds, it lets the Word of God do the attracting through short readings, silence, and meaningful conversation. A gentle path to expansion, preparing hearts for deeper study, from Ruhi circles to the hidden words and beyond. Facets of One. Many scriptures. One God. One humanity. Are you ready to start the next circle?
Hey, welcome back. Right before the break, as we're rushing through this, Abdu Murray was already sort of racing ahead into, okay, what's next for you? Into the future world of AI, Ray Kurzweil, all these things. We could even go back regression, right, to Isaac Asimov and the laws of robotics, right?
Yeah.
But anyway, here's the thing. As you were talking, I was getting this image of dinosaurs, right? Whose bodies became so large. One theory is their walnut-sized brains couldn't manage the mass, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's many theories as to how the dinosaurs died. And the warm-blooded mammals came and ate the dinosaur eggs, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whatever was the end of the dinosaurs, there's a tipping point, right? And as we rush headlong into this, the earth can't support it, the earth can't sustain it. And we are not advanced enough to reach out into worlds beyond ours to fuel our appetite for this thing that you're just describing, where AI becomes God in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
So there's probably a pending collapse, right? There's a wall we're going to hit.
Mm-hmm.
Just in terms of not just resources on this planet, but also the structure of our society, the structure of our cities.
Mm-hmm.
We could go back to Yeats and the Second Coming poem, "The center does not hold."
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I
So
think that.
So what's next for you personally, as you're writing now about AI, you're looking at all this. What's really next for you in your work?
So I have an immediate, and then I have a sort of an intermediate understanding what's coming in the future. And it's funny when you do these strategic plans, like for your organization, you used to do a 1, 3, and 5 year. Well, the 5 year is ridiculous now because you have zero idea what will happen in 5 years. So no one does 5 year plans anymore, and rightly so. So I have more of an intermediate and an immediate. My immediate thing that I'm thinking about now is how do we recapture the sense of the transcendent in us and in our relationship to God? Because the more technology begins to become commonplace, the research is showing the less we think of ourselves, the lower we think of ourselves. OpenAI, Microsoft, and MIT released some research, and it's in its nascency, but I think it's strongly indicating where we're going, is that the more we use artificial intelligence for generative purposes, in other words, to create the presentation, to write the essay, to do the script for you, the more cognitive debt we incur. And so where I'm thinking, what I'm writing about in my book—
Unpack cognitive debt for me.
Sure, absolutely. So when cognitive debt is the one, we lose a sense of judgment and a sense of discernment, where we can actually make judgments between good and bad ideas, where critical thinking really starts to atrophy. Also, memory begins to atrophy. Is that if you need to memorize certain lines of a presentation or whatever it might be, or remember what you wrote, you can't do it because the other thing wrote it for you. And the more we rely on the LLMs to do our thinking for us, the less critical thinking we incur. The less critical thinking we are able to do. It's like any muscle. You don't use it, it atrophies. Well, there's a reason why the average human male has a grip strength far weaker than what we used to have in the 1950s. It's because we don't need to grip things as highly as we used to. Well, if we stop thinking,
but isn't there a reverse of that? Because full confession, I use AI a lot.
Mm-hmm.
But what it does is it allows me to create more quantity.
Mm-hmm.
of all the different streets. So I guess as I'm processing this quickly, I'm kind of a jack of all trades, and that's part of my strength, is being able to understand across all these different fields.
Sure.
And AI helps me go faster and deeper into those. And the critical thought processes that I apply is cross-disciplinary.
And that's what I would say back to that, Wade, is that I use it all the time, by the way, too. It isn't a matter of don't use it, because that's just naive.
Right.
Because, and by the way, you've been using it for decades anyway. The minute you use the GPS system, even the TomToms and the Magellans we used to use, that was AI, very weak, but you used to use it. So that's just naive. What I am
well, my sense of direction has gotten worse. I'm completely unable to find my way.
Well,
so point taken, right? I am totally dependent and reliant on GPS.
and me too, and everything feels like it's north because everything points up.
But not only that, it's also the number of trips you have to take, the speed with which you have to calculate and shave minutes off. It has also optimized our ability to travel and commute. But anyway, we're in a rabbit hole.
But this goes back to there's benefits and there's everything on this side of heaven has a light side and a shadow side. The light side is that we can do more. I'm really looking forward to seeing some of the things develop with regard to medical science, and I'm eager for that. What I am cautioning against is the use of AI in any way that inhibits human judgment, creativity, and connection. AI that enhances human judgment, creativity, and connection is great. Anything that inhibits that is bad. Mary Harrington put it this way. I heard her giving a talk. She says it's one thing to give a child an AI software package that helps the British child learn Italian so that the child can connect with Italians. It's another thing to give a child an AI chatbot so that the child connects with no one. And that's what's happening more often, is that the cognitive debt, and this is an interesting fact in the research, is that people are using these LLMs on their phone especially to make every decision. Like, where should we go eat? What should I wear? Does this outfit look good? And a number of people who are younger people are reporting, I mean, I think it's something like 1 in 4, 1 in 3, some ridiculously high number, are talking about their inability to make decisions without first consulting an LLM. So it isn't the same kind of thing that you're talking about, which is using it to have creative output and analyzing information and data and challenging your thinking. I mean, I use it when I prepare for my debates. I use AI to actually say, don't agree with me. In fact, disagree with me, and disagree with me as strongly as humanly possible, drawing on the best thinkers in this field. That makes me smarter, not dumber. But what ends up happening is that we start to obey the prompts. I mean, you notice this, what happens. You type into the AI now, and an output comes out, and it tells you, this is the answer, what do you think? And then it'll give you 3 options of a prompt. And people are starting to click the prompts. So notice the shift. We would give AI a prompt, and it would give an output. Now it's giving us prompts. So what my worry, Wade, and my work in the future is going to be about is recovering the idea of the Imago Dei as an anchor that helps us ride the technological tsunami out so that we don't crash into the dam of reality and destroy it. Because my worry is not that the machines will become more human-like. My worry is that the humans will become more machine-like. And we're beginning to see that. But I'm also beginning to see people sort of react to that. And one last bit I'll say on this too is that what I'm looking to analyze in the future with regard to technology is that we're moving from a post-truth world where appeals to feelings and preferences matter more than facts and truth. We're moving from a post-truth world to a post-trust world. Ask anybody. If you show them a video, and let's say it's completely legitimate, you show them a fantastic thing that happened, and the first thing they say is, oh, that's AI. I'm convinced, Wade, that if aliens ever do come to the Earth, we will not believe it for years.
Well, on that note, now we are definitely looking at what's next. So we're out of time. Abdu Murray, this has been just amazing. I'm going to extend an invitation to come back, pick up on some of the themes, run with them. Hopefully you'll take us up on that, but we're out of time right now. One last thing is the sneak peek, which will come up here in a moment. But any last words? I think you ended on a nice one, but anything you want to leave the audience with before we sign off?
Well, absolutely. I'll say this, is that as someone whose identity was wrapped up in my religious expression, I understand what it's like to have identity crises and not fully understand where you fit into the world along life's journeys. I can say this, is that it can be a scary thing to have to confront the source of your identity when I think evidence and truth line up and say, hey, some things are right, some things you got to change. I understand the existential crisis that can feel like, but I can tell you that the search for truth is actually glorious and always worth it, even when it's uncomfortable. In fact, especially when it's uncomfortable.
Well, I'm going to also extend an invitation to a summit we have coming up in July on exactly that topic, the search for truth. Remind me if I forget. I would like to extend an invitation for you to participate in that summit. For the audience, You are created in the image of God, and God loves his creation. We'll see you next week. Stay tuned for the sneak peek. Gina Zerlo, senior researcher and lecturer in world Christianity at Harvard Divinity School. One of her tasks is to edit the online World Christian database. There was a World Christian bound volume edition number 3 that she got to personally present to Pope Francis in 2019. How do you possibly keep track and monitor and update information about so much diversity?
Every free second of every day I'm spending mired in data that's going into the World Christian database. You're right, it's a tremendous project, studying almost every world religion in every country of the world and Christianity at the denominational level. Just before we hopped on the call, I was working through data on Burkina Faso of what changes are happening there. So every day, a different country. That's how we do it.
As a result of all this research and keeping tabs, what can the viewers expect as takeaways when we dive into that data and expand and explore it?
Help people understand quantitative data on religion better. So I'd love for our listeners to get a sense of what it means to collect this data, synthesize it, but then what it means for them, whether they're part of a religious community. How does understanding these quantitative trends help us have a better idea of what's happening in the world, both locally and globally?